Hello, everybody. Welcome back. And as I hope you can notice, I have a new camera and also a new microphone, new equipment, because we're already on the come up. But besides the new equipment, today's video is going to be about morality, objective morality specifically. Now, as many of you already probably know, morality plays a major role in our everyday lives, especially in our everyday interactions with other people. There are a lot of assumptions about what's right and wrong to do when you're having a conversation with somebody. In politics, there are even more assumptions about what's right and wrong to do when you're thinking of things like taxes, foreign policy, and protecting freedoms. And even internally, we're all born with a moral compass, a conscience, so to speak, that guides our moral behavior, tells us what's right and wrong to do, and lets us reflect on past decisions to see if what we did was right or wrong. And our conscience tells us maybe we shouldn't have done that thing in the past because it was wrong for us to have done something specific to another person. But how can we even know that these assumptions are valid in the first place? What if our assumption that murder is wrong is wrong? Is there even an objective way of knowing if we're right or wrong? Is there an objective way of determining how we ought to behave in certain circumstances? What even is objective in the first place? Do not worry, I will not be arguing that murder is okay in this video, but I will be arguing for a concept known as objective morality and moral philosophy. I'll be arguing that there is an objective way of determining how human beings ought to behave in certain circumstances. But first, I'll start off with defining and kind of breaking down the term objective morality because it is a loaded concept. Now, the term objective morality obviously combines two words, objective and morality. Starting with the first word, objective, according to Merriam-Webster, the word objective simply means expressing or dealing with facts or conditions as perceived without distortion by personal feelings, prejudices, or interpretations. An example of something that is objectively true is 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is completely true, regardless of personal biases, personal judgments, personal preferences. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, no matter what human opinion on the issue is. Objective is simply the opposite of the word subjective, which simply refers to personal biases or judgments, like the taste of food, for example. I personally subjectively believe that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, even though I will argue to the death that chocolate ice cream is better. Regardless, chocolate ice cream is my subjective preference. Now, morality is a term all of you are probably already familiar with. It simply refers to a code of conduct, a way of determining if certain actions are right or wrong. When you combine the two, you get objective morality, which in my own words is a factual, real way of determining if certain actions are right or wrong. If murder, for example, was objectively wrong, saying murder is immoral would be no different than saying 2 plus 2 equals 4. Neither would be expressions of preference. There would be real objective facts about our world. Many people don't think this way, though. Many people think that saying murder is wrong could be an expression of preference, like the fact that I like chocolate ice cream. It's not objectively wrong. Some people think that moral terms don't really make any sense at all. They're just completely devoid of meaning and have no use, so to speak. If I were to say murder is wrong to these people, they'd probably say why. Or if I said you ought to be nice to other people, they'd also probably say why. Because they don't think there's actually a justification for saying these things. They don't think that you can prove that murder is wrong or that you ought to be nice to other people in the same way that you can prove 2 plus 2 equals 4. They don't think that they're objective in the same way. These people, however, I think are wrong. And that's what I'll be proving in this video, that objective morality truly is real and that there is an objective way of proving that humans should act a certain way. First, I need to establish that every moral doctrine is produced with reference to some general principle or concept in mind. For utilitarians like myself, this is the principle of utility, which essentially states that in any given instance, we ought to maximize the most happiness possible for the most amount of individuals possible. Without some principle like this, it doesn't have to be that. Without some principle like this, any moral doctrine that someone generates is completely meaningless. It can't be objective. Because if you ask this person why we ought to do something, they'd have no reason. They couldn't justify it. So it's clear, in order for me to prove objective morality, I need to prove my reason. my principle is the most intelligible or rational basis for morality. That is how you prove objective morality first. As utilitarian, like I just said, I'll be arguing that pleasure is the most rational basis for morality. And my definition of pleasure is definitely very, very important to my reasoning. And I use a definition from American philosopher Derek Parfit. Parfit's definition says, all pleasures are when experienced, wanted, and better or greater the more they are wanted. And the reason I like this definition is because it can encompass a wide variety of experiences, from eating ice cream you like to winning a scholarship or graduating. And all these experiences are undeniably pleasurable. They bring people happiness. And I'll be using happiness and pleasure interchangeably throughout this video. From Parfit's definition, it's clear that pleasure is simply the fulfillment of our desires. When we're eating ice cream that you like, it's pleasurable because we want the ice cream. And when we're happy, when we're getting married, it's pleasurable because we want to get married. In situations where people are forced to be married, they aren't happy. They aren't experiencing pleasure. The only reason that experiences are pleasurable is because we want to experience them while we are experiencing them. Conversely, pain can be described as the absence of pleasure or the negation of our desires. When we're experiencing something that we don't want to experience, that situation can be described as painful. So when we desire a situation, it's pleasurable. And when we don't desire a situation, it's painful. It's easy to see now how the two just flip-flop when our desires change. If we desire something now that we didn't used to, then that experience has become pleasurable to us as opposed to painful like it used to be. And on the flip side, if we don't desire something now that we used to, the experience has become painful as opposed to pleasurable. I also need to show that the only thing that can be desired in and of itself as an end is pleasure. It's almost tautological or circular to say that we desire pleasure, since again, pleasure is simply that which we desire. So to say that we desire pleasure is simply saying we desire what we desire. All of our other desires are simply derivatives of our desire for pleasure. You don't desire to eat your favorite food, you desire the pleasure that you believe eating your favorite food will bestow upon you. If you didn't desire that food, then eating it would no longer be pleasurable to you. The experience would become painful. So you don't desire the food itself, you desire the pleasure that you believe the food will grant you. Another piece of my argument for objective morality rests on the fact that all conscious and volitional action is motivated by our desire. And I've already gone over this point in my last video on free will, so I'm not going to go over it completely here, but you can watch it at this timestamp right here and see how I prove that point essentially. The last piece before we can start all putting it together is this one fundamental concept of moral philosophy. Ought implies can. What this essentially means is that to say that somebody ought to do something means that they have the ability to do that thing. Imagine somebody saying that George Washington ought to have prevented the extinction of the dinosaurs, or that a person with blue eyes ought to have been born with red eyes. These make no sense at all, because ought implies can. You have to be able to do something in order for somebody to say that you ought to do it in the first place. If you bring this all to its logical conclusion, how can anybody say that we ought to maximize anything other than pleasure? If somebody said that we ought to put a principle like freedom above pleasure and strive for freedom rather than pleasure, then this would produce contradictions in practice. As I've said earlier, all action is motivated by desire or pleasure. So if we sought to maximize freedom, then freedom itself would necessarily become pleasurable because we're striving for it. So this person would be saying that we ought to put something above pleasure, but we would still be putting pleasure first, and it would be producing a contradiction. The only way that we can have a stable basis for morality that doesn't produce contradictions is by saying that we ought to maximize pleasure. And like I just said, ought implies can, which is another reason why it makes no sense to say that we ought to maximize anything other than pleasure. It's because we can't maximize anything other than pleasure. If humans actually strive to maximize anything, then that thing must necessarily become pleasurable. It may not have been pleasurable before, but once we actively strive to maximize it, it becomes pleasurable, which is another reason why it creates contradictions between one's words and one's actions. When you say that we're not maximizing pleasure, but we actually are, in practice, maximizing pleasure. It seems like basing morality off of pleasure is the only way we can have objective morality. As I've just shown, basing morality off of anything else produces contradictions in principle and in practice. Basing morality off of pleasure is not susceptible to this contradiction. So It is the most rational basis for morality and the only way we can have objective morality in the first place. Once this has been accepted, there are completely objective conclusions that can be derived from this starting point, pleasure. Because pleasure is not some abstract, socially constructed idea. It is a felt experience. It is an objective phenomenon. With developing technology, we can locate the areas in the brain that directly are related to pleasure because our brains adhere to the laws of biology, physics, etc. So naturally, facts about our brain and consequently pleasure are facts about the natural world, the objective natural world. If someone put two individuals in front of you and asked you which one is happier, even if you don't get the answer right, there is still an objectively correct and incorrect answer to the question, unless both are equally happy, in which case it'd be a trick question. But regardless, again, pleasure is an objective phenomenon. It relates directly to states of the brain. So there'd be an objectively correct answer to that question. Even if you can't know in practice, in principle, there's still an objectively correct answer. If someone said would raising taxes lead to greater overall pleasure later on, even if we can't know now, the answer still does exist and is completely objective, regardless of people's opinions on the matter. Just because we don't have access to answers right now directly, that does not mean that the answers don't exist in the first place. If someone said murdering other people brings about greater overall pleasure, they'd be wrong, objectively so. And consequently, murder, in cases in which it would bring about less overall pleasure, would also have to be considered objectively immoral. One thing that I think is very, very important to stress is that even if we don't have direct access to the answers to every moral question, does not mean that the answers don't exist in the first place. Even in hindsight, with certain policies, it's kind of hard to contrast them and see which ones brought about greater overall pleasure. But that does not mean that the answers don't exist in the first place, that there wasn't a policy that was objectively better at bringing about greater overall happiness. Like, it may seem impossible to answer somebody if they said, would planting 324 trees right now lead to greater overall pleasure 755 years from now? But that doesn't mean that there isn't an objectively correct answer in the first place. As Sam Harris said in The Moral Landscape, our inability to answer a question does not indicate anything about whether the question has an answer at all. I hope all of you feel equipped now to answer all the moral nihilists if they say why after you assert that we ought to do something. You can say, well, it brings about greater overall pleasure. And if they say, why ought we maximize pleasure? You can go on proving why pleasure is the most intelligible and rational basis for morality. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. See you later.